Tachyon, Croyd, Cranston, Jack, Braun, Captain Flint, Brain Trust, Earl Sanderson, Silver Helix, Chop Chop, Young Troll, Stopwatch, Will-O-Wisp, Turtle, and Xavier Desmond.
So today it's Wildcards Book 14, Part 2, Breath of Life by Sage Walker, about a new character named Zoe Harris, whose ace name is... she takes on an ace name in this story, and it's Blowjob, which is very silly. I believe it's been established that Sage Walker did not come up with that name. That was Kevin Andrew Murphy. And somebody, I think, at some point wisely realized that that name should just never be used. I mean, it's just too silly, and it takes you right out of the story. So she sort of calls herself Blowjob for a page or two, and then realizes that that's silly, and she's pretty much just Zoe from then on. I actually call her Blowjob a couple times in one of my Wildcards essays, and I remember my editor was like, my essays on Tor.com, my editor has not read the Wildcards books, or at least not that one. And yeah, she was very struck by that name. Like, seriously? But at any rate, it's because her power involves that when she blows on something, she can make it like an inanimate object. She can make it temporarily come to life and kind of control it. So she can. In the story, she does it with small things like a teacup, but she also does it with like a mannequin, and the mannequin ends up being able to sort of fight for her briefly. And but anyway, yeah, A Breath of Life. That's hence the title. This one, similar to My Sweet Lord, in that it doesn't actually cover much in the way of the Card Sharks storyline, but it puts Zoe and some of her supporting characters on a plane to Jerusalem at the end. And that's important for Black Trump. She sort of has to be in Jerusalem for the sort of start conditions of Black Trump. And then that takes us to A Dose of Reality, co-written by Laura J. Mixon and Melinda Snodgrass. Snodgrass writes Dr. Bradley Finn, once again, just as she had in the previous book. Laura Mixon in the previous book wrote about Joan Van Rensselaer in a story set in 1968. And one element of that story was that Joan and her husband, Brandon Van Rensselaer, had a daughter named Clara, who I think is maybe like 4 years old in that story. So now it's the present. It's 1994 in marked cards. So Clara is an adult. It's 26 years later. So Clara is a scientist. She's a card shark. So Clara Van Rensselaer has a kind of unlikely romantic connection with Bradley Finn, despite the fact that Bradley Finn is a wild card and Clara is working on the Black Trump virus, which will kill all wild cards. What a meet cute that is. It's a long story. I mentioned previously that Laura J. Mixon's stories are almost more novellas than short stories. They're very long. This one is another one that's very long, but it kind of needs to be. I don't know what the word count is, but it's by far the longest story in marked cards, and it kind of has to be because it does kind of start. I mean, what they're trying to do to make this romance plausible between a Joker and a woman who wants to kill all Jokers. You need to take some time to really sell us on that one, and arguably it still does happen pretty darn fast, but. You got to make some allowances. I mean, they're trying to accomplish a lot in one book. So it more or less works. There's also a really, I mentioned last time that I really love Mixon's writing, and I think, and I love Snodgrass's writing of Bradley Finn. I always like when she writes that character. But Mixon, I think in particular, has just a really heart-wrenching, heartwarming scene, a couple actually, that really hit just right. There's some stuff involving kind of the whole familial stuff with Clara and Brandon and Joan. That's just really they really sell it. They really they're going for some maximum emotional impact, and I think they succeed. And that's it. And that that kind of sets things up. Characters are sort of set up and put in place for the big climax in Black Trump, which is coming up next. But yeah, I think enough happens in this book, even though there is a lot of setup for the next book. I think this one still succeeds on its own terms as just being a very satisfying book that sees a lot of satisfying moments of triumph for the protagonists, the characters that you're rooting for. It's not just like hopeless odds against this sort of monolithic, unbeatable conspiracy. You do get a sense that even though they're pretty damn formidable, they do have weaknesses, and characters like Black Shadow and Mr. Nobody are capable of doing them damage, which is very, very, very satisfying to see. And one last thing about this book before I close that I just wanted to call out, because I always thought it was pretty great. Previous books, most memorably to me, Volume 2 and Volume 3, did a trick with... in order to have all these characters and authors feel connected, one of the tricks they did was to have a MacGuffin kind of pass from one character to the next, even as different authors are kind of picking up the narrative. So they had the singularity shifter in Volume 2, which in practice is always described as just this black sphere. A lot of characters just call it the bowling ball. And the bowling ball kind of passes from one character to the next, and it's just kind of a fun MacGuffin to kind of track over the course of stories by different writers. As different characters get a hold of the bowling ball. And then in Volume 3 there was something similar with the stolen journal, a bag full with 3 books in it, but 2 books of stamps and then a journal. But the books, I guess, is were the MacGuffin of that one, with different people getting their hands on this bag of books. And that was, like, again, a fun thing. It kind of gave almost a little bit of farce energy, as much as there's a lot of sex and violence and drama and melodrama and crime and murder. You got this kind of fun little bit of comedy in the form of this MacGuffin kind of changing hands and being chased by different characters. And so Volume 14 there's elements of it that remind me of that, although it's not an object, but there's 2 things that I would single out. One is this kind of subtle kind of running joke about the character Crypt Kicker. He's a character that's introduced in Volume 11, and his power is that he can't die, or more accurately, he's sort of already dead. The character, in his backstory, it said that he committed suicide pretty gruesomely, shot himself right in the face, and then was buried, and then he kind of rose from the dead, and so he's kind of not quite a zombie, although certainly there's a sort of zombie energy to him. But he's got these really formidable powers, kind of super strength and acid running through his veins instead of blood and all this stuff. Not very bright though, and so he's very suggestible and easily sort of coerced into doing what other people want, because he doesn't seem to have a very powerful will of his own. And so he's a wild card who's in the employ of the card sharks, even though the card sharks are obviously very anti-wild card. They're perfectly willing to exploit a character like Crypt Kicker, who's already dead, so he can't, or at least on some level he's already dead, and so he cannot die. And so there's kind of a gag. Different characters end up having to fight him, and often at the end of each story they seem to kill him, but then he's just back again in the next story. So at the end of the Walton Simons Mr. Nobody story, he's dealt with, but then he shows up again to fight Vagabond, and then he's sort of essentially killed at the end of that story, but then he's back in Feeding Frenzy to fight Black Shadow, and Black Shadow seems to kill him, but then he's still back later. So it's a nice little funny gag, and it actually has kind of a payoff in Black Trump. And then the other one is not quite a gag, but it takes advantage of the whole sleeper concept in a fun way. I mean, the sleeper, we get a little of this in previous volumes, where the sleeper is a character. Every time he goes to sleep, he wakes up with a new look and different powers. And that's played a lot of different ways over the course of the book, over the course of the series, I think. But Volume 14, Marked Cards, I think, is the first time that we see kind of an unusual take on it, where almost a little bit like Crypt Kicker, Croyd is a character who in this book, he just kind of keeps showing up but each time he's sort of had a bit of a sleep and woken up again, so he's different. So once again, he first shows up in My Sweet Lord, and then he shows up again in Feeding Frenzy, and then he shows up again in one of the interstitials, and then he shows up again in the Zoe story by Sage Walker. Each time he shows up, he's looking different. He's got a different power, and you sort of don't know it's him until he actually says his name. And it's not too different from the way the Sleeper is handled in previous books, but it's just very compressed in this book. Usually you might see him, twice or three times in a book, or if you do, he hasn't always changed right away. The moment when you go from one story to the next, he might still be in the same body. So as mutable as he is, there's always kind of a sense of you get to know him in one form for a while, whereas in this one it's just kind of like, here I am, I'm Croyd, I'm in one scene and I look like this, and then boom, I'm gone, and then I come back and hey, I'm Croyd again, but now I look totally different. And so I think just the compression of that rhythm is an entertaining element of Volume 14 that I've always liked. It's kind of the most Croyd forms we've seen in the most compressed span of time. So that's Marked Cards. Not quite as powerful to me as Volume 13, the start of this whole Card Sharks thing. And also not quite as satisfying as the big climax in Black Trump. That said, there's a lot to recommend in this one. I still think it's really solid, because overall I think this trilogy is really good. And it's got Feeding Frenzy, the Black Shadow story by Walter John Williams, which that story alone just makes this book worth the price of admission to me, because it's just so good. One of the all-time great wildcard stories. So engaging and so much fun to read. So yeah, that story alone just makes this a hell of a book. But many of the other stories, particularly I think A Dose of Reality by Laura J. Mixon and Melinda Snodgrass, and the catching up with Jerry and learning about the whole J. Aykroyd detective agency in the Walton Simons story. Those stand out to me as very good as well. And I like the Vagabond story too. I think it's actually the best of the Vagabond stories. I think kind of transplanting her to the jungle and surrounding her with wild animals just makes for a real interesting kind of energizing of that character that I really like. So I think this one is still still really solid, and it tees everything up very nicely for what is the big huge climax in Volume 15, Black Trump. And Black Trump is the book we'll talk about next time. So long for now.
Give our love back some sparks. He said we'll get your love growing. But before we get going, may I highly recommend Cod Sharks? I like to go out dancing. My baby loves a bunch of authors. Lately we've had some friction, 'cause my baby's hooked on shared world fiction.